What's going on, John Wilkerson?
And I'm seated at the desk you used to occupy in our office. So how about that?
Did they move you over? Is that what happened?
No, it was just vacant.
Well, I always like that desk because you could see who's going in and out. You had kind of the secluded office, and sometimes I wondered, John, do you know who's in the office and might be eavesdropping on us? But you always handled it well.
Yeah. So anyhow, it's great to join you, and I hope you guys are having a great day.
Yes, we are. Go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button so we can bring more people into the program. John, of course, is the voice of the Diamond Vols and one of the best play-by-play guys in the biz, hands down. But John, I would like for you to take part, if you can, in a little thing that we call What the H. So let's get to that right now.
What was he thinking?
Release the hounds.
The Dave Hooker Show.
Keep cool.
A presentation of offthehooksports.com.
So, John, you know more about college baseball. You've forgotten more about college baseball than I will ever know. Why in the world, though, is this super in Hattiesburg instead of Knoxville? I had jumped to the conclusion that I thought it would just be in Knoxville if they advanced past Clemson. Why is it in Hattiesburg?
Well, one, that's a really good question because I'm like you. I thought as Tennessee won its way and swept the field at Clemson, hosted by the number 4 national seed, Volunteers were in great standing to host for a third straight year in the Super Regional round. Now, both Southern Miss and Tennessee hosted last year. Both failed to advance to the College World Series. But I do think that there were a couple of things at play. You could point to the fact that Southern Miss had a stronger regular season as they swept both of their conference championships, regular season and their tournament. They happen to have a coach who's retiring, which is a big storyline. And then it's at least coincidental that on the selection committee that you've got an AD from another school whose son plays for Southern Miss. He is a reserve player. You have another AD now at San Diego who was the AD in Hattiesburg. His son used to play for the baseball team. He since transferred to South Carolina. And then you have former longtime Magnolia State employee. You've got John Cohen, who is the chair of the committee, who formerly was the head coach at Mississippi State, then the athletics director at Mississippi State, and now the athletics director at Auburn. So that's all at least coincidence. But Southern Miss had more wins in the regular season, and also last year, as both teams hosted Super Regionals, they did draw about 1,000 more fans per game than what Tennessee had. So there are some nuts and bolts you could point to and say that's the reason that Hattiesburg is the host. But Tennessee had the better RPI. Tennessee had the better strength of schedule. And Tennessee was more impressive in sweeping the field at Clemson as opposed to Southern Miss. Congratulations to them. Survived the losers bracket at Auburn. But I thought Tennessee, in the end, had at least as many boxes, if not more, checked than Southern Miss did. So I'm like you. I thought they'd be in Knoxville.
So aside from the shenanigans, which you pointed out, and the connections and all that sort of thing, is Lindsey Nelson viewed as a positive or negative when they make these selections? Because the atmosphere I saw last year was insanely awesome.
Yeah, and that's a fair question. I do think that if it were more up to date, it would certainly help Tennessee in situations like this. And I know that they're trying to be as rapid as possible when it comes to getting things updated. It's just that there's been the process of waiting for all the I's to get dotted and T's to get crossed when it comes to finally putting, as Danny White says, shovels into dirt. So it's going to be done in phases. It's not like you can just tear it down to its bones and then build it back out in one off season. But I do think that if it were more of an up-to-date facility, that it would fare better when it came down to a situation like this. That could have been a deciding factor.
Already a compliment. Smoky Mountain Red says the best voice in Tennessee sports. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that up there. It makes John uncomfortable to get compliments, but it's true. Caleb Calhoun, good morning. I'm sorry we got off and rolling. I forgot to say hello. Do you have something for Mr. Wilkerson there?
It's okay. I'm taking that very personal, Dave.
As you should, Caleb.
Thank you, John. Yeah, John, we were talking a little bit yesterday about the politicking of this because I'm weighing two things, and I want to know which one you would think would outweigh if there is any politicking to the committee from, I guess, a moral sense. Because on one hand, you have Tennessee that maybe rubbed a lot of baseball purists the wrong way with the way they carried themselves last year. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But on the other hand, you have Southern Miss, who's probably involved in the worst welfare fraud scandal in the history of America, where they were stealing from Mississippi welfare funds to pay for their own renovations. I mean, so to an NCAA, if there is politicking, to an NCAA official who might make this decision, which one outweighs what?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. And I'll say this. For Tennessee, I think the Volunteers, this year's team, which is very different personality-wise from last year's group, they certainly have had to bear the brunt of everything that people still feel about this Tennessee baseball program. So I think that's at least a fair consideration. And it is also interesting to enter that part of have that enter the conversation in terms of what Brett Favre is alleged to have done in getting some funds that he had hoped to be earmarked for a volleyball facility, since that's where the sport his daughter was playing. So I do think that in terms of the one-to-one conversation, it's probably more of a check mark against Tennessee, since it is within the same realm of the sport that's being decided as to the host site, as opposed to the scandalous things that have taken part in the fact that they did indeed allocate welfare funds for things that were not even close to being going to the people that needed them most.
John, I've been to Vanderbilt Stadium, so I'm well aware of the shortcomings that stadiums can have. I look at Vanderbilt, and I still remember getting in the elevator for the press conference. You had to duck down because there was a beam just randomly above your head. So it's not necessarily number of seats that Lindsey Nelson has, but the infrastructure as far as a broadcast entity wants to come in like you, but an ESPN or whoever, and wants to make these things happen. Are there things that I'm not aware of other than just number of seats that work against Lindsey Nelson that are being currently addressed?
Well, I mean, and I do think that Tennessee has shown and has handled hosting regionals the last 2 years very well, because they just let you know the lay of the land, that you've got two booths that you're going to alternate in terms of who's the home team, who's the road team. You try and get those paired up as best you can. And I think the staff has done a fantastic job. I don't think there was a single issue that Tennessee had that would be any kind of an embarrassment over the last 2 years when it hosted and advanced from its own regional to then hosting super regionals against LSU and Notre Dame. But I just think when it comes down to the total number of spots available, that's probably something that works against it. And the fact that there would be overflow media because the press box has not been really attended to since it opened back in 1993. They have done some slight reconfiguration in the press box to where you have a bigger area, but you also have a couple of spots that are indeed for overflow media that are right there on the concourse down inside the ballpark. So I just think that Tennessee right now could be well served by a severe update in terms of the number of media that could assemble in a press box, as well as those that you could have spots for. But still, again, I don't think Tennessee has to apologize for anything in how it's handled the last two regionals it hosted. But I also think in a situation like this, that you could look at a more up-to-date facility like the Golden Eagles play in, as to perhaps a pretty significant check in their favor, just getting ready for this weekend that Tennessee's about to experience.
So those issues real quick, Caleb, and sorry to jump in. How quickly will those be addressed? I mean, I know they're in the process of renovating. I mean, at what point do we say that infrastructure or the amount of space in the press box, none of that is an issue for Tennessee any longer? How close are we to that?
Well, again, I don't think it is the biggest stumbling block. Again, it might just be part of the equation. But again, I just think that when it came down to 1-to-1, Tennessee and Southern Miss again, both hosted last year, and theirs is a larger facility. And there could also be, I think it would be probably much closer to SEC fatigue than it would be anything that Tennessee doesn't have at its disposal right now or hasn't updated. Because you had a record 8 schools host regionals from the Southeastern Conference. No conference had ever gotten that many host spots before. You had 10 teams, which matched the record, that made it. Tennessee and Texas A&M were the only teams that traveled. The other 8 were hosting. So I just think there might be more of an SEC fatigue, as opposed to, you look at Indiana State being able to host a regional as it did this opening weekend. They advanced to the Super Regional. They've got a huge event going on their campus. Otherwise, they'd be hosting the Super Regional. But unfortunately, they knew that their staff was already allocated to that, so they didn't even put in a bid. And so that's why they're playing at TCU as opposed to TCU coming to their place.
John, talking a little ball on the field with Tennessee baseball, what do you make of this team's, should we say, mental makeup? I mean, I told Dave last Saturday that performance by Zane Denton may be the most clutch performance I've seen from a Tennessee athlete in any sport. And I'm talking even football in that regard. And do you think that the flying under the radar, that it may help them in the sense of they won't put as much pressure on themselves if things go against them the way that I felt they did in the Notre Dame series last year?
Well, I do think that it has been a work in progress, because this team opened with the expectation that they would pick up where last year's team left off, and that was number 1 for the better part of the season, and then only lost 9 games. But this year's team was expected to be more of the same from last year, because you return essentially your starting rotation on the weekends, and that was a great starting point. But you replaced every defensive starter. So you had 8 new starters in the lineup, and it took a little while for things to gel. In fact, it was when Tony Vitello put together his best lineup defensively that everybody kind of was able to catch their breath and start being, as Coach Vitello referred to, as the best version of themselves at the plate. That's when you saw the offense really start to kick in, and they put up some really good numbers. They've got the second most home runs of any Tennessee team, short only of last year's squad. So they've got 122 dingers this year. The pitching staff has not been as sound this year as it was last year, but I think part of that was because, again, you were rounding into shape with what you were able to do defensively. I think Tennessee was as strong defensively. That might have been the best part of their performance this past weekend in the Clemson Regional. They were just so good when it came to playing catch, as they like to say. But Tennessee's been so strong defensively. They've been so strong consistently with starting pitching, and their offense, even though they only had the 1 hit in the loss that they had in the lone SEC tournament game, they've really played well over the last 4 weeks or so. So I think Tennessee is playing its very best ball across the board coming into this matchup. And for them, there is pressure that goes from being the home team when you are at the super regional stage. I think being able to go on the road and realize that it's somebody else's headache to make sure that they have all the ticket requests met and things like that. I think they fully embrace the opportunity they have to go to Southern Miss and play as well as they just did at Clemson.
John, I know you have to roll, but last thing, as far as Tennessee's chances, I mean, I think they're pretty good. I think they can also play the overlooked card, have to go on the road, that sort of thing. And then I think the other thing is they don't have the distraction of last year, that they were a team that was kind of on the edge, which I enjoyed. I liked. I mean, you know me well enough. What do you think of Tennessee's mindset headed into this Super?
I think it's very solid, because they've been able to, I mean, the last box they needed to check was success away from home. They won their last series at South Carolina, took 2 out of 3 from the Gamecocks. They then, of course, had the one game that they didn't win and didn't necessarily play that well against Texas A&M in the SEC tournament. But then they put together 2 really good wins against Charlotte, which won Conference USA's tournament, and then just an instant classic in the 14-inning affair with Clemson. That was toe-to-toe. That was just a fantastic game. And you had the late heroics by Zane Denton to give Tennessee the lead top of the 9th. I mean, each side was a strike away from winning in the 9th inning. Clemson in top of the 9th, Tennessee bottom of the 9th, and then we got 5 more extra innings. So I just think for them to be able to go toe-to-toe with a program that had won 17 straight going into that matchup against the Tigers, I just thought Tennessee did everything it needed to. And I think this is a team that has the right mindset. They've been so good that after being 5-10 at the midpoint of the SEC schedule, they're now a team that just says, what do we have to do? What do we have to deal with today? Win today and then plan on tomorrow when that time comes. So I think this is a team that has its own identity. It's not near or similar to what the feel for the team, the vibe from the team was last year, and that's not a bad thing for 2022. I just think this group has its own feel, its own identity, and right now they're playing awfully confident.
Love it, John. And for those that don't know, where does that door behind you go?
It goes into the newsroom.
But it's permanently locked, so you can't get through it. If there's a fire in the front of the sports office, you ain't getting out.
That's right. It's going to be tough. That's why we always have bottles of water in here, just in case.
John Wilkerson, voice of the Diamond Vols. Have a great call, and hopefully we can do this again when you're in Omaha.